on track?
This meeting is
Okay, so welcome to the Positive Women's Network USA Policy Fellowship. And this webinar is entitled Ending HIV Criminalization Using Abolition Frameworks in Advocacy. And we are so glad that you all took time out of your busy schedule to come and share this space with us. Okay, we have a few housekeeping rules, everybody. This is to keep things moving smoothly, as well as you'll know what you should be doing. First, this meeting is being recorded, so try to stay on mute to keep background noise out, like me and my squeaky chair that I always have. Now, you can enable closed captioning if you need to. We ask that you share your questions in the chat, and you can also raise your hand, and we'll take questions at the end of this webinar. Now, we are in meeting mode on Zoom, and you can mute and unmute yourself using *6 or the mute button on your phone. Okay, the Positive Women's Network. We are the only national membership body created by and for cisgender and transgender women, gender diverse people, and transgender people living with HIV. Since 2008, our members have created a unified voice and built collective power for women, gender diverse, and trans people living with HIV. We believe that racial and gender justice cannot be divested from the HIV response and ground our work in collective liberation. PWN is creating a world where all women, gender diverse, and trans people living with HIV can live long, healthy, and dignified lives free from stigma, discrimination, and criminalization. Okay, and here are our objectives for this webinar. Learning about HIV criminalization. Next, we will be exploring the intersection of HIV decrim work, sex workers' rights, and sex work decriminalization. We'll also learn how an abolitionist framework influences decriminalization movements. And here is our agenda. We've had a welcome and we still welcome you, anybody who came in after we first started. Um, and we had an introduction to PWN. We will be having a presentation. Uh, After the presentation, there'll be a Q&A section for everybody. Uh, at every webinar, we always have a call to action, and then we'll close out. Now, this is what we have all been waiting for. We have some superstars in their field. We have Kamaria Laffrey, Jenna Torres, and Jada Hicks. And I'm going to turn it over to you ladies and let you introduce yourself and tell more about your organizations.
Thank you, Myra. Hi, everyone. It's good to see everyone. I'm Kamaria Laffrey. I use she, her pronouns. I am a co-ED at SERO Project. And a fun fact about me is I was a part of the first fellowship cohort for
Oh,
PWN and wouldn't be doing this work without it. So really grateful for this program, for this opportunity to pay it forward. And I'll pass over to Jenna and Jada.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Jada Hicks. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Senior Positive Justice Project attorney at the Center for HIV Law and Policy. I don't feel like I have a fun fact that can even remotely compete with that. I was like, wow, that's actually really, really cool. I guess my fun fact is that I'm in Colonial Williamsburg with my family right now. So it was really cool. Like we went canoeing today and to think like we are in the same waters that the Powhatan Native Americans were on was like a really cool experience. So I will pass it over to Jenna.
Hi, my name is Jenna Torres. My pronouns are she, her, and prefer my name. I am currently based out of Atlanta, Georgia, but I am from New York. I am the executive director of Scarlet Prosperity Project, but I also work with many different organizations across the South and New York. Um, a lot of my background is reproductive justice. I'm a poet, an author, and I use art as advocacy. And I would say a fun fact about me is that I have been doing advocacy nonprofit work for over 10 years, and I started as a young person at 19. And so now we've made the decade mark in nonprofit work and movement work, and I'm really excited about that. And I'm complete.
All right. Thank you, ladies. And now we'll turn it over to Kamaria.
Thank you so much, Myra. Before I get in to my portion of the presentation, I like to always remind people I am not an attorney or a medical professional, and that I hope you take this webinar as informational only. Um, and if you or someone you know is experiencing criminalization or have any epidemiology questions, please reach out to a trusted legal support or medical expert. And there are several people living with HIV-led organizations that can guide you, but cannot guarantee legal representation. And with that, one of those organizations is the SERO Project, which I'm super proud to co-lead with Tammy Hott. We center people living with HIV leadership to end HIV criminalization, mass incarceration, racial and social injustice by supporting inclusive people living with HIV networks to help improve policy outcomes, advance human rights, and promote healing justice. Next slide, please. So a really straightforward definition of HIV criminalization that I appreciate using is it's the unjust and antiquated or old use of criminal laws, policies, and practices to punish people living with HIV based on their HIV positive status. And this definition was pulled from the Demanding Better HIV federal policy agenda, the first ever written by people living with HIV. Next slide. So I like to kind of ground people in ways to think around how bodies are criminalized. And so I have a larger training called Be the Change. And there's like 7 statements. I read them with no context. It's intentionally written and spoken the way it is. And then I have people agree or disagree. And then we go into conversation afterwards. For the sake of time, I'm just going to give you all 2 statements that I will read with no context. Each of these statements are up to your own interpretation and understanding. I will read them at least 2 times, and then I'm going to move quickly to the next statement. Usually, folks can use the chat or they'll raise their hand if I do it in person to say they agree or disagree, also for the sake of time and just for something for you to process internally. Just hold your response of agree or disagree to yourself and just keep note of which one you chose. For anybody who may join in the midst of this, I also want to say these statements are not to be taken as true or false when you see them on your screen, but whether you simply agree or disagree. And just try, I wrote that wrong. It says try to choose one or the other. So please just pick one. So next slide. The first statement, agree or disagree. Sex workers would be less vulnerable to HIV criminalization laws if they're required to take PrEP. Agree or disagree, you do not have to use the chat. And I'll read again and then move on to the next slide. Agree or disagree, sex workers would be less vulnerable to HIV criminalization laws if they're required to take PrEP. Next slide. Remember, you do not have to use the chat. Second statement is agree or disagree. Proof of malicious intent should be required in cases where HIV transmission occurs. Agree or disagree? Proof of malicious intent should be required in cases where HIV transmission occurs. And then if I can have just a little facilitator privilege, Kelly or whoever's doing slides, apologies. Could you go back to the first one and I'll offer some context? I did see some people use the chat. I can't see it. That's another reason why I'm asking folks not to while I'm looking at the slides. But just to offer some context, when I do this training, I don't tell people that their answer, if they agree or disagree, is right or wrong. I'm just offering more information around why this statement's written the way it is. So in doing legislative strategy and having conversations with policymakers and community stakeholders and getting them to kind of shift their minds around all the people that are impacted by HIV criminalization, this is one of the statements I would read to kind of gauge where they're at. And ultimately my response, if they agreed or disagreed, would be that bodily autonomy involves having the right to choose what goes in your body. Real HIV prevention means access, trust, and support, not forcing, coercion, fear, or punishment. Requiring something like a medication will eventually turns healthcare into punishment and further targets an already over-policed population of people and contributes to the removal of individuals' dignity. Next slide. For proof of malicious intent, this is should be required in cases where HIV transmission occurs. This is a conversation many coalitions have around changing the wording of their existing statutes on criminalization. And for those that may not fully understand, malicious intent is ultimately like deliberately, willfully desiring to cause harm, and it's premeditated, like it's thought of ahead of time, it's planned out, you're mapping out how you're going to cause this harm. And many cases of HIV criminalization that exist today do not establish that. Whether it should be required in cases where HIV transmission occurs is a different conversation, but the laws currently, many of them do not consider intent at all, malicious or whatever the opposite of malicious is. If there's intent, there's intent. Next slide. And I meant to ask my friends at CHLP if this was the most recent map, because I feel like we have had some changes. But currently there's roughly 32, 31 states that have laws specifically criminalizing exposure to and or transmission of HIV. And you can get a fuller idea of what these states, each state has with CHLP's state guide that they offer, as well as other maps that show how criminalization is enforced in different states, even for states that don't have specific HIV crim laws on the books. Next slide. So just diving deeper into HIV criminalization, I do apologize for all the text. I usually have, thank you, Jada. I usually have pictures, but I wanted to have this also. I know this will be sent out afterwards for people to reflect on. But ultimately, in addition to that straightforward definition of criminalization, it's a racial, gender, economic justice, and public health issue, and it's not treated as a public health issue. It's disproportionately used to target Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, especially those who identify as cis or trans, gay and bisexual men, gender diverse, people who use drugs, sex workers, and immigrants. Criminalization and the enforcement of it and the threat of criminalization increases the risk of violence for women living with HIV. Incarceration and criminal records have lifelong effects on ability to exercise rights and access support systems. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. And HIV prevention, treatment, and viral suppression only work when our healthcare access is stable and equitable. Criminalization is a systemic tool that is not needed if public health resources are treated as the sustained investments our communities need to live. Next slide. This is a clip from our HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day toolkit. And if you're ever like struggling with like, what is the quickest, easiest way I can talk about HIV criminalization when I'm trying to explain this issue to someone, this is one of my favorite graphics to use. It's just 5 things you should know. The laws don't work as intended. They don't support public health. They don't align with current science. They don't decrease stigma and discrimination, and they don't make sense for the justice system. And another piece I like to add is as of to my knowledge, there are no journals or studies that prove or establish that the existence or the enforcement of the laws of HIV criminalization laws contribute to lowering HIV transmission rates throughout the country, well, throughout the world. Next slide. Uh-oh. Oh, it's one of those slides. Apologies. HIV transmission is seldom a factor in prosecutions. So a lot of people have been prosecuted when HIV transmission did not happen. Even when there's transmission was extremely unlikely or impossible, current laws don't consider whether a condom was used, whether a person's undetectable viral load or treatment history, their established treatment history. If you can click again and maybe the other bullets will pop up, thank you. And that the alleged exposure posed no potential HIV transmission, such as oral sex, biting, scratching, or spitting. There are people who have been arrested, even in those, even establishing that those three things, one of or all of those things were present. And while there are different numbers and vague data around it, there's not always consistently a documented report that suggests only a small percentage of prosecutions actually involve HIV transmission. And it's hard to get that data because of every Department of Corrections system is different. So it's hard for us to get a full picture of what that percentage could look like. And a disproportionate number involves behaviors like spitting or biting, which carry no risk of transmission. So there's very little cases that actually establish HIV transmission actually happening. Not saying it doesn't, it's just there's not a lot of them. Additionally, disclosure laws don't always take into consideration someone's proof of disclosure. Next slide. And so people have asked us often, like, what can you do to protect yourself? And as I said at the beginning, this is not official legal advice. Please consult an attorney if you're facing HIV criminalization. And there's really no like foolproof strategy that's ideal, but some of these things can help give peace of mind to a person living with HIV that's navigating disclosure to their partner. So SERO Project, we have a disclosure agreement contract. It's a trifold kind of brochure. And when you get these slides later, this pink link will take you to that PDF that you can fill out, download, fill out, print, and make it sexy. I don't know how to make paper cuts sexy, but you can use this as a proof of disclosure, having yourself and your partner sign it. You can also use email and social media interactions. Just screenshot it and print it, and maybe have like a folder or a thumb drive that's stored in a very special, safe location. Sending that to a trusted source. Somebody that you can call on should something happen and you need those records pulled up, especially in this day and age where you can generate conversations through AI, you can delete messages, and it looks like you're only talking to yourself. As soon as you disclose or as soon as you set up some sort of interaction with someone involving your disclosure, please do your best to screenshot as much as possible. And don't take for granted that just putting in your profile that you're living with HIV or that you can be Googled, such as myself, that's sufficient enough proof of disclosure, because some prosecutors or judges may ask you at point of intimacy, did your partner understand how HIV is or is not transmitted? And that's sometimes a little more tricky to navigate. This last bullet, I put asterisks by because it's a little tricky. It's not my leading thing that I would tell people to do. But you can introduce your provider to your partner, and in that session, have your provider name that you're on your treatment and or are virally suppressed, and have your provider mark in your chart that your partner came to this appointment and has received that information. The reason this is tricky is because should you ever be accused of criminalization, your medical records more than likely will be subpoenaed. And if at any point before that interaction, or even after that interaction with that disclosure with your provider and your partner, if your records show that maybe you weren't undetectable, or that you weren't on treatment, or that you had something else going on, the prosecutor can set up a timeline that actually makes you look like you are intentionally trying to give someone HIV, even if that's not the case. So I caution people about that last bullet, but I also don't think it's not possible for folks to utilize. As again, like I said, a lot of this just helps give peace of mind that you're doing everything you can to communicate your disclosure to your partner. Next slide. And honestly, the fact that like we even have to have strategies on something like prevention is, I don't know, it just stresses me out a little bit. Other ways of how we tell people to protect themselves, especially once investigation or law enforcement is involved. SERO Project, we tell people living with HIV, if police or investigators are contacting you, do not talk to them if you're being accused. Tell them you want your attorney, you want a lawyer. I know that's easier said than done in many, many areas for many, many reasons. But the more you acknowledge, the more information they have to build their prosecutorial case, essentially. But we try to tell people to not acknowledge their HIV status. If they ask, are you HIV positive? You don't have to say anything. You're not having sex with the person that's arresting you. And if you are, that's a different webinar for a different day. Do not provide any sort of bodily fluid samples or give permission for any medical tests. Don't sign any documents that they put in front of you. Sometimes they'll coerce you by saying, if you just sign this paperwork, we'll let you go home and then we can work this out in court, or something silly like that. Don't sign anything unless you have an attorney present and fully understand what you're signing. Also, don't volunteer any other information, like you might be asked, who do you know? That might be connected to the person that's pressing charges. You don't have to verify that you know anyone. And also, like, implementing a community assurance plan is pretty much what I was explaining on the previous slide. You can also find resources through a lawyer, through organizations such as Lambda Legal, the ACLU, SERO Project, CHLP. I don't know why you're not on here, apologies. Or another HIV, and why that's lowercase, HIV friendly trusted source. You can always reach out to us and we will do our best to connect you. We'll help you map out like who's in your state, what other legal resources are present. Like, I'm based in Florida, so there's a Southern Legal Coalition. And I work with them often when folks are in situations like this, of just getting information, mostly to make sure that once people are arrested, that they still have access to their treatment. Next slide. And I don't know how I am on time, so I'm gonna kind of push through. So the impact of HIV criminalization that it has on the community always ultimately goes beyond the courtroom. It intersects with racism and classism and bigotry. It doesn't protect or provide or improve public health, and it controls and enforces marginalization of many, many of our communities of women, people of color, transgender, diverse folks, the LGBTQ plus communities, sex workers, immigrants and migrant communities, and people living in poverty, just to name a few. And what's really frustrating about this is that I think, as we all know, when folks are put through the carceral system, like, it also takes a toll on your family, your household, and being able to have resources and support beyond that. Next slide. And a lot of things that folks don't realize, like when they're reading these Facebook posts or articles and see that someone's being arrested or being charged or being accused, that a lot of what prosecution looks like happens before you're actually prosecuted. So having media sensationalism attached to your name, and having a loss of privacy, whether you're convicted or not, and even if the charges are dropped, your name is ultimately forever attached to a URL of some sort, especially if media gets a hold of it. Prosecution can also look like a felony conviction of 30 years or more. And some states like Arkansas, Louisiana, Ohio, South Dakota, and Washington state have sex offender registration statuses. Tennessee is one of the states that was able to get theirs uplifted in relation to HIV criminalization, where it's no longer a penalty. And then we all know like difficulty finding employment and housing once you have an arrest record, regardless of what's on that arrest record, is another form of what prosecution can look like. And another part that a lot of advocates were able to mobilize around and get the guidelines updated and changed is the threat of criminalization. And the threat of criminalization also exists for people who can breast and chest feed. So there have been cases where women live with HIV who, whether they're virally suppressed or not, but ideally who are virally suppressed and want to try to breast or chest feed their child, are told by lactation counselors and their medical team that they cannot do that, should not do that. And if they're found out that they are doing that, they'll be reported to DCF. So then you have the threat of criminalization as well as having your family disrupted. So a lot of education around HIV, viral suppression, what treatment looks like, is still, 40 plus years into this, is still highly, highly needed. And also, of course, at any point when someone's arrested and has a record, or gets or has to serve time in a facility, you end up having the loss of rights to vote, to travel, to move as you please, or what's safe for you, and to choose where you live. And they're all incredibly life-altering things that happen beyond the judge hitting the gavel. And two examples are the photos on the side of co-founder of SERO Project, Robert Suttle, and his story, I think most of us are familiar with, but this is just an image of what his driver's license looked like, and right under his photo, having sex offender on that. And just think about all the times you have to use your driver's license. So you're disclosing this penalty to people that don't really need to know that. So I just wanted to add that as something to share. Next slide. This one is for folks to refer to after the webinar. They're just two clips of our videos from our YouTube channel. In 2011, SERO Project did a documentary featuring 4 or 5 people living with HIV and their stories of criminalization. Robert Suttle is featured in here, as well as this is Nick Rhodes that's pictured in the screenshot. And then most recently in 2025, we did a documentary on the Tennessee Sex Offender Registry and folks getting off of that, featuring Tiffany, Michelle, and LaShonda from Tennessee. So check those out. One is 7 minutes, the other is 35. Next slide. And then I'll close with just I know I will be closing the full webinar with more calls to action, so there will be more details on this. But one thing my co-director, I remember her sharing with me, I don't remember the context of why, but she shared this quote of, ask yourself if you want to make a point or do you want to make change? And I think about that a lot when I think about how complicated HIV criminalization is and how I just want to prove a point to legislators. I just want them to get it. And I realized I learned through asking myself that question of like how you have to sit with strategies and being in different spaces that may be uncomfortable for you. But SERO is here to help. And you can join our listserv, connect with other people doing this work nationally and on a state level. You can also sign on to this HIV Basic Consensus Statement, which I think we'll talk about more at the end of the webinar. And then, of course, next year we'll be going into our 6th year, I think, of HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day on February 28th. And next slide, and I think I'm done. And then a quote I've always been saying since I started speaking about HIV, because people used to always thank me and say, knowledge is power. And that always irritated me because we can know things all day, but if you're not activating that power by applying what you know and assessing what you're willing to do, then do you really have any power? So knowledge might be the power, but activation of that power is the application of what you know and are willing to do. And with that, I will close and pass to Myra or Jenna. Yes.
Thank you so much for that, Kamaria. It was impactful. It was some inspiring information that you gave us that we could take back to our communities. I had the privilege to go One of the first conferences I went to with HIV is not a crime 5, I think, and it was amazing. It was amazing, the information, hearing the stories of people who have been criminalized just because they were living their life. But yeah, but that's what PWN does. We get the information out and we help support and love on our peers who are going through things. And next we have Miss Jenna. The floor
Hey
is yours.
everyone, thank you. Hi, so my name is Jenna Torres. I am an organizer around sex work advocacy and reproductive justice, public health, and I've been doing this work for over 10 years. And so my slides and most of my public speaking has always been about demystifying sex work and sex work decrim. And so I appreciate Kamaria of how they included a lot of resources and a lot of research. And mine is more based about personal experiences. I am a sex worker. I have been a sex worker since I was a teenager. Something important to note is also I have been criminalized, and I'm also a young mom. I had my first child when I was 14. I had 3 kids by the time I was 17, and I was also placed into foster care at a young age. And so all of those things are kind of backgrounds to why and how I do the work that I do now. And so this brief portion of our presentation today will be talking about sex work decrim and the overlap between decriminalization as a whole. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so you may or may not have seen the symbol of the red umbrella. The red umbrella is an international symbol for sex worker rights. And it's also a reminder of our collective demand for protection, our solidarity, and our resistance against violence and discrimination. Um, it's important to note that the red umbrella actually was part of an art installation from Code Red in Italy, and then was adopted in 2005 as our international symbol for sex worker rights. So anytime you see a group of red umbrellas together, 9 times out of 10, they are doing sex worker rights and advocacy. And had the privilege of going to Germany 2 years ago for the International AIDS conference, and I got my red umbrella tatted on me. So I am officially part of the red umbrella gang. Can I have the next slide, please? Awesome. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about what sex work is. The term sex work was coined by Carol Lee. She is late and great. She has passed now, but she was also known as the Scarlet Harlot. She coined this term, they say, sometime in 1970s, but on most records, it will say 1978. Her framework was to redefine prostitution and foster empowerment and reduce stigma, and definitely encourage the relationships that people have in the sex industry, because we are talking about a labor right issue, and that's why sex work is work. Um, Sex work is an umbrella term, and there's also a spectrum of experiences in sex worker land, and it describes multiple types of sex work experience or sex trade experiences. There are dancers and indoor escort providers, outdoor escort providers, porn, BDSM, and many more. And then um, there is also the spectrum of experiences that are legal and criminalized or illegal. And so, depending on what type of work you're doing and where you fall in that spectrum, also who you are, where you're doing it, your identity, this all impacts how criminalization is seen towards you. Can I have the next slide? Um, it's also very important to note that not everybody in the sex industry not everybody in the sex work industry categorize themselves as sex workers. Language is very fluent. And so I know a lot of people who may be strippers or dancers or burlesque dancers who may or may not feel like they're part of the sex work industry. Y'all can't hear me? Maybe I need to take my headphones off. Let me know. Yes, no?
I can hear. I think you might just be a little bit soft, but I think you're good.
All right. Let me see if I can get myself. Does that sound a little bit better?
Yes.
Okay. So, let me see if I can. Does that help?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I'm glad that you all can hear me. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Great. So, as I was saying, sex work is a spectrum of experiences. There are legal forms of sex work, there are illegal, criminalized forms of sex work, and also not everybody who participates in the same kinds of jobs or the same kinds of work would consider themselves a sex worker. So this term is a very fluent term. It is also, people will use the language is most closely identified with them. There's some people who will never consider themselves to be prostitutes, but there's some people who will. There's some people who will never call themselves an escort, but there's some people who will. And so the term sex work helps us identify as advocates the sex trades, but not everybody who participate in the sex trades will consider themselves to be a sex worker. So that's just something important to know. And then also, we honor people of their lived experiences. If you are, for example, a burlesque dancer and you tell me that you are not a sex worker and you're not part of the sex work industry, I respect that. I'm not forcing anybody to claim that title or be part of this community. And so I just want that to be stated. Throughout this process, I'm talking about people who agree or are in alignment with this definition of sex work, and just to know that there are criminalized versions of sex work and legalized forms of sex work. Can I have the next slide? Cool. So when we're talking about criminalization of sex work, essentially, I'm talking about escorting, I'm talking about brothels that don't exist in Nevada. I'm talking about things that are outside of the entertainment sector. And even if you want to talk about some of the legalized forms of sex work, like strip clubs, webcamming, things of that nature, it still is a very gray area when it comes to if you have a license, is the place that you're working licensed to work? There's a lot of things that come into how safe are you on the spectrum of criminalization. Sex workers in general have a really interesting relationship with criminalization, more so because we sit at the intersections of a lot of things. So sex work in itself is about a lot of the things that I find is people have an issue with morality, whether or not people should be selling their body. People have a lot of things around racism. For example, there are brothels in Nevada that exist. And from my understanding and what I have been told, that there is a very specific type of person who can work in those industries in that place. Sexism is a very big thing too, because they think a lot of the perceptions is that only women identified people do sex work, and that is not true. People of all genders do sex work. And then there is a fear about sex work, more so around the public health aspect of sex work. There is a misconception that people who are in the sex industry contract STIs all of the time, or they are just running rampant in the community. And that's definitely a misconception about how we are taking care of our health. And if there is a person in the industry who has contracted STI, that's more about access to resources and making sure that people have the proper information about taking care of themselves and getting things rectified. The biggest thing too is about the conflation between sex work and human trafficking. I have a really interesting conversation or perspective about this conflation because when I started doing sex work, I was 15 years old, 16 years old, and I did not know that what I was doing was considered to be sex work. I had children by this point, and and there was always people who wanted to talk to me, and I felt like if you want to be in my space and in my energy, then you're going to have to come with something because I have children to take care of, and I'm not going to trade my time with my children for free. And so that is one of the thoughts that I had. And I didn't know at the time that there was like a group of people who did it. I didn't know that what I was doing was part of sex work. And yeah, so I got online, I posted ads, I didn't think anything of it. And I was arrested when I was 17 years old. I had just graduated high school. I was getting ready to start my college career, and I got caught in a underground sting operation. And yeah, it was a really interesting conversation because the police officer basically told me that I was not smart enough to do this by myself, that I must have somebody who is trafficking me, must have somebody who is forcing me to do it. And if I told him who did it, then he would let me go. And so that is like entrapment, that is coercive behavior, it's manipulation, especially as being a young person. And at the time that I was arrested, I was in New York City. And thankfully, at the time, we had something called the Human Trafficking Intervention Courts. And so if you had been arrested for sex work and you've never had a record prior, you go through a program, anti-trafficking program. If you are a minor, you go through a program and you are considered to be CSEC, which is commercially sexually exploited child or youth, which is what I was. And basically, they make you go to these religious-based organizations where you promise not to go back to the industry and that you're going to get your life together, and they give you $5, a Metro card, and pizza and send you on your way. And my caseworker at the time was like, yeah, I don't think you belong here. And so they introduced me to an organization called Red Umbrella Project that was based out of Brooklyn. And at the time, they were doing research about the Human Trafficking Intervention Court. Criminalization in New York City at this time, which is around 2014, 2015, looked like condoms being used as evidence. If you had 3 or more condoms on you and you were suspected of doing sex work, they used the condoms as evidence to prove their case. If you had easy on, easy off clothing, such as dresses, sweatpants, things that you can manipulate to get on and off quickly, they use that as evidence. This is a lot of times that we would see the walking while trans situation. And at the time, it was called a loitering charge. And so a loitering for the purposes of prostitution. And essentially what the law said was, if there is any person in a particular area trying to stop passerbyers for 5 or more minutes, then they can be considered loitering for the purposes of prostitution. And so through the research that we did at Red Umbrella Project, we found that Black and brown people were disproportionately arrested, as we could have guessed. More specifically, Black and brown trans people were arrested disproportionately to everybody else, which we could have guessed. And so this is kind of what really started my curiosity around, one, what does sex work look like in a more progressive place like New York City versus places like Georgia? And what does that have to do with our health outcomes? If I can get the next slide. So because sex workers are typically in a very unique position where we sit at the intersections of public health, anti-violence, and labor rights, we often see a lot of the issues before many other practitioners do. So for example, if we are on the message boards around a client having bad date lists, things of that nature, we may come across somebody who's truly in need of support, who truly is being trafficked and needs our support. And we may witness that first before any organization or any police official may have that experience. And even a more important note to add is around our sexual health. And so learning a lot about sexual health, STIs, the transmission of STIs, is a very critical part of our care and how to advocate not only for ourselves but for others. I was on a previous meeting where I had noted that in my 10 years of me doing this work, I don't think that I've ever heard somebody say sex work and HIV as an identity together for themselves. Now, while we know people in the community may exist in both communities, maybe living with HIV or maybe a sex worker, I don't think I publicly ever heard somebody put those two things together. And I think it has a lot to do with the criminalization or the fear around criminalization if you are doing sex work and you're also a person living with HIV. And so from my perspective, this makes it really difficult for us to be able to have community resources and support people in our communities and offer them the resources that they deserve because they're so siloed and isolated in our community. I will also want to note that in our community, in sex worker community, there is a spectrum of privilege. There are people who have more privilege than others. For me, when I did sex work, it was a survival-based sex work. I did sex work to take care of my kids, to make sure they had something to eat, to make sure that I was okay. And so my ability to turn down a client or for me to turn down a date looked a lot different than somebody else who may have been in a different income level or had a different experience with clients than I had. So there is a spectrum of privilege that exists in sex work. Not everybody is a survival-based sex worker, and not everybody is a privileged sex worker. It really just depends. So can I get the next slide? So now that we know that criminalization exists for people who do sex work, what now? So part of the advocacy that I have witnessed in my 10 years of doing this work has been around the health outcomes and the outcomes in general for people who are in the industry. We noticed that in places in the world that sex work is fully decriminalized, not legalized, decriminalized, they have better health outcomes, better life experiences, better access to resources. Now, legalization looks like the brothels in Nevada, where you have to have a license or be frequently tested or have some part of you identified with a database in some way. Full decriminalization means that y'all mind your business. Y'all mind your business. Simple. And so where there is full decriminalization and people are able to navigate their life as if they were running a regular business, just like any other work, sex work is work. We have transactional relationships all of the time. Sex work is not the only place where you have a transactional relationship. We notice that people have a better quality of life, better outcomes, and better experiences. If you are not familiar with the Amnesty International report, they called for, which is I just want to say this is a really not unique situation, but unique to us. They called for and agreed with the full decriminalization of sex work in 2015. We are now more than 10 years later, and they are still calling and advocating for the full decriminalization of sex work. The other places in which we show up is in the United Nations. There is a report called the Universal Periodic Report of the United States, and they agreed to, in 2015, they also agreed that the best outcome for people in the sex industry to not be harassed by the police, to not be targeted, to not have poor health outcomes, all of the above, is to fully decriminalize sex work. we are still working towards that, at least in the United States. There's other places that have offered decriminalization. I think the most recent place was Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's that. I also want to note that the criminalization of sex work definitely took a turn when our administration got elected the first time. When the administration got elected the first time, there was a very big push, a successful push in something called FOSTA SESTA. And FOSTA SESTA essentially is, FOSTA is Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, and the SESTA is Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act. And essentially what that looked like was trying to funnel sex workers into kind of a corner. They went after Microsoft. They went after our bank accounts. They went after anybody who was going to support sex work, whether it's by allowing us to have bank accounts with them, using their platform, webcamming, whatever it was, the government went after them. And so that made it even harder for us to be able to advocate for ourselves, because a lot of people went underground, a lot of people went dark, a lot of people went back to street-based sex work. There was a lot of things that happened during that time. A lot of people became very unstable during that time because people were afraid to be posted. Desiree Alliance is another reason why we don't have a conference. It's because FOSTA SESTA and because of our current administration. And so all of that is kind of what has condoned our criminalization. It's about morals, it's about protecting the babies, even if you make sex work completely decriminalization in this moment, sexual assault, sex with a minor, all of those things are still going to be illegal. And so we have to do a better job, even though I'm a young person who's done sex work. As a young person, I also don't advocate for young people to do sex work. I think that it's our responsibilities to show for our young people and provide them with the resources that they need in order to make autonomous choices. And so I don't judge or turn down young people who do sex work. I obviously care for them and give them education the best way I can. But I don't also want to condone that, because I understand what it's like to be a young person in the sex industry. But once you become of age, and if this is what you choose to do with yourself, that's not any of my business. I want to make sure that you are getting the resources that you need and the support that you need. And that's really it. So I think there's one more slide after this. Okay, so really quickly, before we talk about where does HIV live in this conversation, up until 2018, there was at least 2 states where police officers had legal immunity to have penetrative sex with a sex worker prior to arrest. And even now, there's still a gray area where brief sexual contact is allowed and still a legal trend in the US. So there is abuse of power, there is abuse in the legal system. This also aids into the misconception about what human trafficking actually looks like in the United States, because there's a lot of people like myself who was forced to carry the title of human trafficked, even though that had not been my experience. And that gives the anti-trafficking and anti-sex work people even more room to say that they that this should not be allowed. So where does HIV live in this conversation? It lives everywhere. And the reason why it lives everywhere is because we are talking about stigma, we're talking about fear, we're talking about misinformation, decriminalization, discrimination, and all of these things run concurrent with sex worker movement. And so I believe that all sex workers stand in solidarity with the decriminalization of HIV, because we want decriminalization for sex work. And so the best way that we can move forward is, yes, by having the education and having the spaciousness to have open and honest conversations, but also to the earlier point is to have access to that, and making sure that people have the ability to do that. So the next slide, I think I gotta go off this room. Okay, so once again, my name is Jenna. I'm on social media. My handle is Poetic Litterheart. I have the privilege of working with a lot of organizations called Best Practices Policy Project, Melissa Strada Mutual Care Collective. I've been part of the Equitable Care Certification, Sister Love in Atlanta. I've had the ability to do all of that. And my main pathway to talk about sex work and the criminalization of sex work is by using art. So I am a poet. I do writing workshops. I have people in the industry who do writing workshops. And this is the way that we get to talk to civilians, vanilla folks, about our experiences. And it's not a dialogue. It's not a conversation. It's not a back and forth. I said what I said. This is my experiences, and I'm owning that. And so to be empowered in our own lived experiences and also advocate for the well-being of everybody else is the priority. So yeah, so I thank you so much. Just some really quick tips. You all will get a link to a magazine that Best Practices Policy Project released around the United Nations. There is some of my poetry in there, and there's also like a full color spread of other sex workers and their art in there. If you're interested in anything else, I would say to look up the Amnesty International sex worker ruling, and also the United Nations ruling around sex work, because those things are really important, especially if you think about the human rights, like the ability to have human rights. If you actually look at what the United Nations say about the human rights, is really where as organizations we have thrived, and we know that we're best placed in it. So yeah, so thank you so much. I'm gonna get kicked out this room, but I'm gonna be in another part of the library listening very intently.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenna. That was some much needed information. Oh my goodness. It was a lot too, but there are so many people of color, our people who are being criminalized because of sex work. I know in a neighboring community here, they would do a sweep every once in a while, some type of sting, and they only picked the women up on the streets that were of color. You never saw anybody else in the paper. So it's something to be considered to keep us safe. And now we have, not last but not least, we have Miss Jada on the scene, ending
Thank
HIV
you.
criminalization and using the abolitionist framework in advocacy. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Myra. So I'm going to go ahead and bring us on home. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about my organization. CHLP is a multiracial organization that uses a Black feminist queer lens to analyze the issues of discrimination, criminalization, and oppression of people affected by HIV and other stigmatized health conditions. And HIV criminalization represents a facet of the broader oppression of people living with and deeply affected by HIV, but especially Black people, LGBTQ plus folks, working class folks, people who use drugs, and people who engage in sex work. Next slide, please. So I just wanted, because we're talking, moving into abolitionist principles, I wanted to touch a little bit on our Advancing Justice Rooted in Liberation strategic plan for CHLP. And all throughout 2025, we went through a process where we took a step back and asked ourselves really big questions, like what does it mean to build a future where people with HIV and other stigmatized health conditions can be free from surveillance, punishment, or criminalization. So I really encourage folks to check it out. This really guides our work and really acts as an avenue for transparency in how we show up in spaces and what principles and politics we apply to our work as well. Next slide, please. So for this, I think it would be great if people could use the reaction toolbar. Kelly, if you can click, it should pop up here. And so how many people have heard of abolition before? Also, feel free to answer in the chat if you want to. Okay, so a fair amount of people. Next slide, please. And then how many people here identify as an abolitionist? Oh, I'm seeing a lot more reactions than I usually do, which is very exciting. If you can progress to the next one, please. And then how many people think that abolition just means getting rid of prisons or defunding the police? Okay, a few folks for that. Okay. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I always like to ground my presentations with shared language and a shared understanding of what exactly we're talking about. So this is our working definition of abolition. It is not a monolithic movement. So abolitionists do not envision a world without harm, but a world that addresses harm differently, where both police and prisons are not at the root. It's a political framework, a viable organizing strategy, and something that we have to practice each and every day. So it demands that we get rid of interlocking systems of prisons and policing, known as the prison industrial complex, and it also the conditions that create the need for those systems. So rooted in the 19th century slavery abolitionists, today's abolitionists organize, educate, and advocate that prisons and policing as institutions don't grow public safety. In fact, it is because of today's abolitionists that we know the depth and width of violence that prisons and policing has in our lives. Instead, we demand that we build systems of true safety that are rooted in accountability and other non-punitive ways of addressing harm and violence. As abolitionists, we do not only seek to address systems, but also the ways that we have internalized these messages around punishment and policing, really trying to challenge that internal police officer that has been instilled in us since we were children. And so critical resistance defines an abolitionist vision as one where we must build models today that we can represent how we want to live in the future. So it means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us towards making our dreams real and that lead us all to believe that things could be different. It means living this vision in our daily lives. Next slide, please. So this is a theory of change that asks us to rethink the role of the state in responding to harm. We're going to be challenging assumptions and instead pushing us to questions the kinds of systems that we are building,
The meeting is being recorded.
The tools that we rely on, and who is most impacted on them. And that really means looking at those underlying causes of injustice. It includes looking at structural inequality, racialized economic systems, and the social conditions that make certain communities more vulnerable to criminalization in the first place. And so only by engaging in the root causes can we really begin to imagine responses to harm that don't reproduce the same cycles of punishment and control. Next slide, please. And so abolition really asks more of us than just to critique individual laws or policies. We really have to analyze cause and effect. We have to understand how different systems work together to produce this harm. It's not done in isolation. So at its core, abolition is really about transforming social relations so that everyone has universal access to resources and conditions that we all need to survive and thrive. It also requires taking leadership from those most directly impacted by criminalization and structural violence and recognizing that their experiences and analysis are central to building effective strategies for change. So abolition involves dismantling institutions that produce what we described as social and civil death, meaning systems that strip people of dignity, rights, and full participation in society. And it's not limited to just opposing prisons or policing alone. It's also the systems that sustain inequality and harm across different sectors. That includes recognizing the role of racial capitalism And racial capitalism is a framework that explains how capitalist systems accumulate wealth through the extraction of social and economic value from marginalized racial groups, but particularly Black people, Indigenous people, and other communities of color. So it helps us understand how economic systems and racial hierarchy are deeply intertwined and how those relationships shape who is exposed to harm, exclusion, and criminalization. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is fundamentally abolition in and of itself, and as a practice, it's a collective project. It's not something that an individual can achieve alone or through isolated efforts. So the scale of what abolition seeks to transform and these broader conditions makes clear that no single person, no single organization, no single institution can accomplish this work alone. Instead, it depends on collaboration across movements, communities, and different sectors. It's going to require a shared strategy, mutual accountability, and sustained relationships that are going to be built over time. And we know from doing this work, different people bring different forms of knowledge, experience, and leadership, and we depend on those contributions. And so, in this way, abolition is about a practice of building, working together, and building collective power strong enough to challenge and ultimately transform entrenched systems of harm. And actually, that's what I think is really powerful about this presentation today is bringing in and into this space people from different sectors and facets. And this is exactly what abolition is about. Next slide, please. And so often when we hear about abolition or we discuss abolition, we'll hear, but what about and what does that mean? So, what I like to say when people ask, what about them, and fill in the blank for whatever they're asking about, does our current system actually get at the root of the problem? We incarcerate more people than any other country. Has it ended crime? Do you feel more safe? Do prisons and policing address harm? Do they prevent harm? So asking these questions that really challenge the way the system is designed and set up today. You don't have to have all of the answers, right? You're not expected to have all of the answers, but it's really about envisioning what we can do and understanding what's not working. Next slide, please. I just want to point out too that we have to get rid of the conditions that remove bodily autonomy, goodness, and that make healthcare so much worse for our people, but especially Black people and especially the folks in the South. And so really confronting those conditions and getting at the root. Next slide, please. I want to provide a few examples of what abolition looks like, because I think that a lot of you have actually seen and heard some of these examples and didn't actually realize that it was abolition in practice. And so I just wanted to name that the Black Panther movement, they provided the People's Free Health Clinic. And not only did this provide free health care, but it was responding directly to the exclusion and racial discrimination present in mainstream healthcare systems. So not only did it provide medical services, but they also integrated patient advocacy. They offered legal aid, housing support, and assistance navigating systems that we know are all too often hostile to Black communities, communities of color, and people of lower income communities. So the People's Free Health Clinics represented a broader model of wellness that extended beyond traditional institutional care, designed specifically for Black communities who are already disproportionately criminalized, over surveillance, and denied access to equitable health care. And so this approach really framed health as inseparable from housing, legal rights, economic stability, and positioning care as a form of political resistance, as well as a public health intervention. And this is really a holistic approach to abolition in practice, but also healthcare as well. Next slide, please. So another example of abolition in practice is the Shanty Project's response to the AIDS crisis. It really represented a development in the history of mutual aid and community-based building and care as well. And so this was support for people living with HIV. Their model really became known as the San Francisco model of AIDS care. It emphasized coordinated relationships between AIDS service organizations, hospitals, research institutions, and social service providers working together to support people living with HIV. And so they participated in the National Lesbian and Gay Health Conference in 1983, and they were joined by other people living with HIV in developing the Denver Principles and a foundational statement of patient rights and dignity in the AIDS response. And so in practice, not only did the Shanty Project address immediate material needs that included housing instability, but they kind of provided a framework for how to engage and meaningfully engage with people living with HIV and AIDS as well. Next slide, please. This is actually a very local and recent example. So we're getting a little bit closer in time to where we are now. And I think it's useful to provide real world examples that you can literally see in this day and age as well. And so Mayor Brandon Scott's approach in Baltimore included a comprehensive violence prevention strategy that directly offered resources to people most at risk for gun violence. So through this model, individuals who were at high risk of either committing or being victimized by gun violence are identified, and they're engaged directly by case managers. And they're offered concrete supports designed to help them move out of the cycle of risk. So that includes housing assistance, victim services, substance use treatment, mental health care, and job training opportunities. So the city used about $50 million in American Rescue Plan Act funding to implement and scale this work, allowing for expanded outreach and service capacity across neighborhoods most impacted by violence. So overall, this approach was built around direct engagement, individualized support, and connecting people and resources that address the underlying conditions associated with gun violence. I hope what you're able to see through all of these examples is they took a multifaceted, holistic approach. All of them did. And they're really trying to get at, like, there are multiple reasons, right, for this example, why someone would be more at risk for gun violence. Housing, economic instability, those are different factors. And so each of these examples tried to tackle those structural inequities that are at the root of why someone would maybe be more at risk, for instance, of gun violence, or why the program for the free health clinic was started. And so really trying to do a approach that handles all of those structural inequities instead of a siloed approach. And so thinking of when you're thinking of abolition and how abolition shows up in your work, just making sure that it's not a siloed approach. Next slide, please. I also wanted to provide as an example the work that we've actually done within our own organization and within PJP. So PJP, Positive Justice Project, is our national campaign to end the criminalization of HIV and other stigmatized health conditions. Over the course of 12 months, we actually developed and refined our guiding principles. And these sessions where we met with our facilitator, we met 9 times with a strategic planning facilitator. They represent a broader effort to revisit and update our earlier principles, which have become outdated and no longer fully reflected our current abolitionist framework and political commitments. And so a key part of this process was really grounding the work in both reflection and practice. It wasn't just about revising language, but rethinking how our principles align with the realities of HIV criminalization and broader systems of state violence. At the same time, we had our PJP Partners group that was established, and it created an ongoing space for collaboration and shared strategy. So this group brings together trusted and aligned partners so we can learn from one another, build collective analysis, and develop strategies that respond directly to current conditions. And so the Partners Group really is a mechanism for ongoing feedback on CHLP's research and resources and advocacy work, ensuring that we produce work that is informed by those closest to the issues and people of lived experience. And so during our first in-person convening of the Partners Group, we actually presented the principles and got feedback, and we were able to then incorporate and strengthen and sharpen the principles by taking that feedback and incorporating it into our guiding principles. And so it's more than just an internal guide. It's really meant to make our approach visible to others that are working in this space, partners, coalitions, so that you can understand our framework for how we're operating and be in conversation with it as well. It's intended to be generative. And so I hope that you'll also check that out. Next slide. Lastly, I just wanted to name some other abolitionist organizations that are showing up in our space and that I think that you can reach out to and have resources, if you want to learn more about abolition. The last slide is just about our org, and so I will turn it back over to Myra.
All right. Thank you. Now, that was an awesome presentation. No job, and I am so glad that you agreed to come on and give us this useful information, because we have to take care of us. Okay, we're getting close to time, and I still got a thing where I can't see. Did anybody have a question?
We did a great job with 63 people here.
Yes, the people showed up. I did see one question that was uh, in the chat. It came from Kenya Musa, and she asked, "Is there a lot of racism in certain states for sex work?" So I think that would go to Jenna.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, hold
See,
on. It's racism really just depending on what type of sex work you do and where you're at. I find that if I wanted to market myself in New York City, I would lean more into my Afro Latina behavior than my Black behavior, just based off of my experiences. And it's not necessarily like it's not necessarily just criminalization of sex work or police. That plays a part in it too, but it's also like the type of opportunities that you get as far as the spectrum of experiences. So when you are talking about how likely are you to interact with the police, you're more likely to interact with the police if you are a street-based worker, if you are on the internet in a very visible way, if you don't have like a private website, things of that nature. And so, yeah. And then the more covert, I guess you could say, forms of sex work, they are more selective about the type of people they want representing their brand or their industry. And so, yeah, racism definitely does play a part. And then also like how the police treat you and how they look at you and how they categorize you also plays a part in that. There is a a community-based research study that was done by the Red Umbrella Project. I think it's still available online. And it definitely goes into the demographics of who has been targeted with those wonderful loitering charges. So yeah, racism.
Okay, thank you for that. And I believe that to be true. It plays a great part. Racism does in every facet of our lives.
And all our life. I know I've been watching social media lately, and there's been a lot of human trafficking, a lot. And most of them, especially in Philadelphia, just up the street from me, not too far from me.
Okay. The intersection of human trafficking and HIV. Could somebody give us a really quick snippet of how that shows up?
Can I speak?
Yes.
This is this is Monica
Hey, Monica.
Charleston. Hey, how is everyone?
Everyone's doing well.
Hi.
Yeah,
I
quick
can definitely
snippet.
answer on that. I can definitely answer. I am a human trafficking survivor. Um,
Okay.
yes, definitely. I am the founder and president. Well, I'm a founder of Monica's Law. So Monica's Law is a vacation law that was passed unanimously in the state of Virginia. for people that have been trafficked to have their records erased, vacated, or sealed. It was named after me, and it has since expanded, and there's different variations of it. But that definitely came from out of Virginia. I'm very proud of myself of that. However, thank you. It passed in 2021. Um, in this space, as before, because I've been away for a couple of years, just doing some healing and doing some personal stuff and working on my nonprofit. It's really, I don't really see the space for people that have been trafficked and also are HIV positive in this community. It's like we're often overlooked. So I know sex workers have rights. I get all that. I'm for anybody who want to do whatever they want to do with their body. I'm okay with that. However, when you're being forced to repeatedly have sex or unprotected sex, um, for someone else's profit, someone else's gain. You don't really have a choice as to whether you want to use a condom or not. And you're being, criminalized for it. People know my story. I was arrested over 177 times in the state of New York alone. I'm going to court on Monday. Everybody pray for me in Virginia to have some charges in Virginia expunged from my record from being trafficked. Yeah, everybody get. I'm going. This is historical. I'm going under my own law in the state of Virginia.
Wow.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you for that. And we will definitely keep you in our
Yeah,
thoughts and
yeah.
prayers and sending you lots of light and love.
Thank
Oh,
you. But are there
wow.
any
That's
other resources or anyone else out there that have the same shared experiences as me? Could you please reach out?
and we can help you to reach out to Monica. Just hit us up and we'll try to connect anybody who wants to connect with her. Okay, moving right along. I think it's time for our call to action.
All right,
And
amazing.
Kelly.
Thank you so much, Myra. This call to action has actually been kind of already teased by every single one of our presenters. Jenna, Kamaria, Jada, I just want to share my immense gratitude to you all for this really rich and powerful webinar. Um, I am here to talk about the HIV Basic Consensus Statement that Kamaria also introduced. One of the things I just saw in the chat is the love that the theme of bodily autonomy is tied this entire presentation together. And I've also really been sitting here reflecting on that the human right to decide what does and does not happen to our bodies has been something that every single presenter has touched on. HIV Basic stands for Bodily Autonomy, Surveillance, and Informed Consent, led by Michael Scarce and Melanie Reese. Shout out, they're in the room right now. The HIV Basic is a collection of people living with HIV, PLHIV networks, privacy advocates, health law and policy experts, and abolitionists who are raising the alarm about the risks of public health surveillance systems that track and store data on already hyper-marginalized, criminalized, and hyper-stigmatized communities without regards for our human rights. So HIV Basic really sits at the intersection of understanding how public health surveillance and criminalization are interacting to put people at risk, especially people who are already most vulnerable to criminalization. The Center for HIV Law and Policy, PWN, the SERO Project, the Transgender Law Center, and the HIV Justice Network are leading this push to build a broad-based coalition grounded in shared values to demand that public health respects our privacy, our right to informed consent, and bodily autonomy. So we're calling on everyone in this call, whether you're joining as an individual or an organization or both, to join the over 90 organizations that have already endorsed the statement. The statement is grounded in the principles of liberation, bodily autonomy, the right to health data privacy, and freedom from criminalization. I think we all know how much is at stake right now. Our work and our communities are under consistent and escalating attacks. And the way that we fight for our collective liberation is by blocking authoritarianism and state violence that's targeting and hurting our people, and building power with a transformative vision for healthcare that responds to the needs, conditions, and human dignity of all. If you look at the link that was dropped, you will see the full statement. The actual principles that we espouse in this document should not be controversial. It's like, if you believe in MIPA, if you believed in informed consent, if you believe in bodily autonomy and that we should not be criminalizing people because of a health condition they have or who they are, then this is the statement for you. I encourage you to join, and I will stop there and pass it back to Myra.
Right, all right, all right. Okay, everybody, please adhere to our call to action. And we thank you so much for showing up to this, our final webinar in this Policy Fellowship series. We thank our speakers for coming, showing up and showing out with some awesome information that can really help our communities to thrive and be safe and everything. And I want to give a little shout out to my co-coordinator who's not here with us right now at the moment, Meta Smith Davis. And I guess this was the end of this presentation. But now, listen, now you can join us for our graduation to celebrate our PWN Fellows. That is June the 25th of 2026. And I guess that's it for us.
Good night, and thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.